An estimated $330 billion crosses international borders every single year without a bank transaction, a wire transfer, or a single document that any government on Earth can trace. That number is larger than the entire GDP of Finland, larger than Chile's, and larger than Egypt's. And it moves through a financial network with no headquarters, no servers, no vaults, and no charter. The system is called Hawala, and it runs on something older and more durable than any of those things. It runs on trust. Depending on who you ask, Hawala is either one of the most important financial lifelines in the developing world, or one of the most dangerous gaps in global financial regulation. And what we'll see in this video is that both of those things are true at the same time, often through the exact same broker. OCIA estimates put Somalia's Hawala volume alone at up to $1.6 billion a year, all flowing through a country with no formal banking system. Back in 1998, Interpol pegged India's Hawala traffic at roughly $680 billion, a figure equal to about 40% of the country's GDP at the time. Pakistan receives somewhere between $5 and $7 billion through Hawala channels annually, according to the U.S. Treasury. Those numbers raise an obvious set of questions. How does a system with no buildings, no accounts, and no records move more money than most central banks? And why, after the Patriot Act, after FATF recommendations, after hundreds of prosecutions, can't governments stop it? We're going to trace Hawala's economics from its origins over 1,200 years ago to its use today by drug cartels, terrorist financiers, and sanctioned nation-states. We'll break down the business model, the fee structures, the settlement mechanics, and the case studies that show how the same network sending a construction worker's wages home also moves cartel revenue across continents. This is the economics of the world's oldest invisible bank. If this is your first time here, we cover the business side of organized crime every day. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Hawala didn't come out of some criminal think tank. It predates paper currency. It predates double-entry bookkeeping. Every commercial bank on the planet is younger than this system. The origins trace back to 8th century India. China developed a parallel version around the same period called Fei Qian, which translates to flying money, built in response to the Tang dynasty's problem of moving tax revenue safely from the southern provinces to the capital. Both systems solved the same universal problem. If you were a merchant hauling goods across thousands of miles of hostile territory, carrying gold or silver made you a target. You needed a way to transfer value without transferring physical currency. The solution turned out to be elegant. Instead of carrying money, you carried information. A merchant deposited funds with a trusted broker in one city. That broker contacted a counterpart in the destination city, and the counterpart paid out the equivalent amount to the intended recipient. No gold crossed any border, no caravan got robbed, and the two brokers settled their mutual debt later through trade goods, future transactions, or by netting balances across dozens of deals over weeks or months. Those brokers are called Hawaladars, and the entire system hinges on reputation. Hawaladar networks form along family ties, ethnic bonds, village connections, and shared religious community. A broker who fails to honor a transfer doesn't face a lawsuit. What happens instead is worse: expulsion from the network entirely. In communities where economic survival depends on these relationships, and that expulsion amounts to a financial death sentence. Researchers Schramm and Taube documented the earliest known legal reference to Hawala in 1327, and some legal historians have traced its influence even further, arguing that Hawala shaped Western legal concepts like the French avil and the emergence of agency in English common law, the idea that one person can act on behalf of another in a binding contract, which had no basis in Roman law, but sat comfortably in both Islamic commercial tradition and later common law. Here's how a modern Hawala transaction actually works in practice. Say you're a construction worker in Dubai, earning $500 a month that you need to send to your family in Lahore. Going through a bank means identification documents, possibly a local account, transfer fees between 10 and 25%, and a 3 to 5 day wait, and that's if your family even lives near a bank branch. The alternative looks like this. You walk into a small shop, a convenience store, a travel agency, whatever it happens to be, and you speak to a man your cousin recommended. You hand over $500 in cash. He charges between 2 and 5%. And he gives you a code, maybe a word, maybe a number. He makes a phone call. Within hours, your family walks into a similar shop in Lahore, gives the code, and collects the equivalent in Pakistani rupees. No ID, no bank, no electronic trail. The two brokers now carry a debt between them. The Dubai broker owes the Lahore broker $500, but they don't wire it. Settlement comes later, maybe through goods shipped from Lahore to Dubai, with the accumulated debt covering the cost, or maybe by netting it against transfers flowing in the opposite direction, maybe through gold. The settlement methods are as varied as the networks themselves, and that's exactly why Hawala survives in the age of digital banking. It solves real problems that formal banking still hasn't touched. Consider Afghanistan, where the World Bank estimates that 80 to 90% of all economic activity takes place in the informal sector. Reliable national banking infrastructure barely exists outside major cities. Hawala isn't the alternative to banking there. It is banking. Kabul's money exchange Hawaladars have been self-regulating since 1930. Over 300 operators working under an executive committee that enforces its own codes of conduct. And even the United Nations and international NGOs have relied on Hawala networks to deliver aid in regions where no other financial channel exists. For hundreds of millions of people across South Asia, the Middle East, and the Horn of Africa, this isn't a shadow system. It's the primary system. And that fact sits at the center of everything that makes Hawala so attractive to criminal organizations and so difficult for governments to regulate. Because every feature that benefits the construction worker in Dubai benefits a drug trafficker, a sanctions evader, or a terrorist financier equally. Speed, low fees, anonymity, no records, cross-border reach. For legitimate users, those are conveniences. For criminal enterprises, they're competitive advantages. Let's look at Hawala the way this channel looks at everything, as a business decision. Running a criminal enterprise that generates large amounts of cash means your single biggest operational problem isn't production, distribution, or even law enforcement. It's what to do with the money. Every dollar of revenue needs to be moved, converted, and integrated into usable financial channels without triggering the reporting mechanisms that banks are legally required to maintain. Laundering through the formal banking system typically costs criminal organizations 8 to 15% of gross revenue, and every step in the process, every wire transfer, every deposit, every conversion, generates electronic records, suspicious activity reports, and potential evidence. Hawala changes that math entirely. No suspicious activity reports get filed. Know your customer verification takes place. Nothing moves through the SWIFT network. Settlement happens through trade goods, cash, or gold, transactions that are either invisible to regulators or completely indistinguishable from legitimate commerce. The FATF has pinpointed the core vulnerabilities: minimal documentation, settlement across multiple jurisdictions through non-bank methods, and the use of businesses that fall outside regulated financial institutions. What makes this especially difficult to combat is that criminal Hawala doesn't build its own network. It buries itself inside the legitimate one. The same broker handling migrant worker remittances during the day handles cartel proceeds at night, and the same settlement channels. Balancing legitimate trade debts also clear illicit transfers. Targeting criminal Hawala means disrupting the financial infrastructure that entire communities depend on. How this plays out in practice became clear in 2014, when a federal grand jury in Los Angeles returned a sealed indictment that would become the first major U.S. criminal case involving Hawala transfers of drug money. The defendants operated a network of Punjabi Hawaladars stretching across the United States, Canada, and India, and their client was the Sinaloa cartel. The business model followed a specific path. Drug traffickers in Canada generated heavy cash revenue from multi-kilogram sales of cocaine and methamphetamine, supplied by the Sinaloa cartel and its affiliated organizations. That Canadian currency needed to reach Mexico, either as cartel profits or reinvested in additional narcotics shipments. But moving bulk cash across international borders carries enormous risk, expense, and increasingly sophisticated monitoring. So instead of physically transporting money, the Canadian traffickers deposited their drug cash with Hawaladars in Ontario. Those brokers contacted partners in the Los Angeles area and authorized the release of equivalent amounts in U.S. currency to couriers working on behalf of the cartels. Cash deliveries happened in hotel rooms and parking lots across the LA metro. From there, the money either moved south to Mexico as cartel profits or funded new drug shipments routed back to Canada for distribution. The Canadian drug proceeds never crossed a border. The U.S. currency the cartel received never passed through a bank. Brokers in India provided a third settlement node that further blurred the flow of value. If from any single regulatory vantage point, whether Canadian, American, Mexican, or Indian, only fragments of the full transaction were visible, and none of those fragments looked like drug money on their own. Federal wiretaps conducted in Punjabi, which demanded specialized translators, revealed the scale of individual operations. Single cash deliveries reached as high as $800,000. One broker named Harinder Singh got pulled over by the California Highway Patrol in October of 2012, and officers found $274,980 in rubber-banded stacks wrapped in black plastic inside his vehicle. While that traffic stop was still underway, ODEA agents conducting surveillance watched Singh's wife leave their apartment complex, carrying a bag that held an additional $388,100, bundled the same way, wrapped in the same black plastic. Over the 4-year investigation run by the DEA's LA Strike Force and IRS Criminal Investigation, authorities seized close to $15.5 million in bulk cash, 321 kilograms of cocaine, 98 pounds of methamphetamine, 11 kilograms of MDMA, and 9 kilograms of heroin. 22 defendants faced indictment, 18 ended up convicted, and prison sentences reached as high as 70 months. But here's the analytical point that matters most. This network worked because it linked 3 completely separate criminal ecosystems: Canadian drug distribution, a Mexican cartel production, and Indian financial networks through a single trust-based system that generated 0 banking records. Each segment operated in a different country, under different laws, in different languages, using different currencies, and the only thread connecting them was the trust between Hawaladars, the same trust that connects legitimate brokers handling legitimate remittances in the exact same communities. Which brings us to a very different case, one that shows the other side of the equation. Al-Barakaat started in 1985, founded by Ahmed Nur Ali Jumale, and by 2001 it had grown into something unusual, a conglomerate with more than 180 offices across 40 countries, processing roughly $140 million per year in remittances. It stood as Somalia's largest private employer. It ran telephone and internet services, construction operations, and import-export businesses, and it served as the primary channel through which the Somali diaspora, scattered by decades of civil war, sent money to family members who had no other way to receive it. Even the United Nations relied on Al-Barakaat to transmit humanitarian relief funds. Fees ran between 5 and 10% per transaction, and unlike a typical Hawala operation, Al-Barakaat maintained centralized clearing, agent contracts, and periodic wire transfers through Emirates Bank International in Dubai to balance accounts across its global network. U.S. branches alone processed up to $1 million monthly. Then came November 7, 2001. Less than 2 months after the September 11th attacks, President Bush designated Al-Barakaat as a terrorist financier under Executive Order 13,224. Federal agents raided 8 offices across 6 American cities. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill called the network the Quartermasters of Terror, alleging that portions of the hundreds of millions flowing through the system were being skimmed and funneled to Al-Qaeda. The economic fallout hit immediately. Remittances accounted for an estimated 25 to 40% of Somalia's gross national product, and the shutdown severed the financial lifeline for hundreds of thousands of families. Money caught in transit froze. Families that depended on monthly transfers from relatives in Minneapolis, London, or Dubai lost their only income source overnight. And then the intelligence fell apart, and investigators could not verify the claims that had driven the designation. The 9/11 Commission's staff monograph described the post-9/11 period at OFAC as chaos, noting that the policy-level goal demanded a major designation every 4 weeks to demonstrate seriousness, and that some evidentiary foundations for early actions were put together under enormous time pressure. Al-Barakaat representatives came off the U.S. terror list by 2006. The UN Security Council delisted all associated entities by 2012. Full OFAC delisting didn't arrive until February of 2020, nearly 2 decades after the raids. Not a single conviction for terrorist financing ever came out of the case. What the Al-Barakaat case exposed was the core dilemma of Hawala regulation. The line between legitimate and criminal use doesn't run between networks. It runs through them, through the same brokers, the same offices, and the same settlement channels. Shutting down criminal Hawala and protecting legitimate Hawala aren't two separate challenges. They're the same challenge, and nobody has figured out how to solve one without creating the other. Drug trafficking and terrorism financing grab headlines, but in terms of raw dollar volume, they may not represent Hawala's most economically significant criminal use. That distinction likely belongs to sanctions evasion, the use of informal value transfer to route around international financial restrictions imposed on entire nation-states. Understanding how that works starts with one city: Dubai. By most accounts, Dubai operates as the world's central clearinghouse for Hawala. It sits at the geographic and economic crossroads of South Asia, the Middle East, and the Horn of Africa, the 3 regions where Hawala runs deepest. It's a major international banking and trading hub with an aggressively pro-business regulatory environment, free trade zones built to minimize bureaucratic friction, and a massive expatriate workforce. Any non-nationals make up more than 80% of the UAE's total population. The U.S. State Department has noted that over 300,000 Iranians live in Dubai, and approximately 8,200 Iranian-owned companies operate out of the emirate. According to the State Department, money laundering risks have grown alongside the expansion of exchange houses, hawaladars, and trading companies across the UAE. As of September 2021, the Central Bank of the UAE and its partner regulators reported just 149 Hawala agencies officially registered in the country, with 95% of those on the mainland. That number represents a fraction of actual operators, something everyone involved in regulation openly acknowledges. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace described the conditions bluntly: loosely regulated gold imports, poor oversight of free trade zones, trade misinvoicing, and the flow of currency through informal systems like Hawala create what they called ideal conditions for trade-based money laundering networks. And that brings us to the commodity tying everything together: gold. The link between gold and Hawala stretches back to at least the 1960s, when Indian and Pakistani expatriates working in the Middle East needed a way to send wages home. The system that emerged used gold as countervalue. Workers transmitted their earnings via Hawala, and the debt between brokers got settled through gold shipped from the Gulf to South Asia. That relationship never broke, it evolved. Gold today functions as a primary settlement mechanism for many Hawala networks because it occupies a position no other asset can match. It works simultaneously as a commodity and a store of value. It can be physically transported, melted down, and re-stamped to erase its history. And it crosses borders as trade goods, personal jewelry, or through free trade zones with minimal paperwork. Once a recognized refinery stamps a gold bar, that bar becomes fungible. Nothing on it reveals whether the underlying metal came from a licensed Australian mine or an illegal operation in a conflict zone. Al Jazeera's gold mafia investigation documented this in detail. Gold from conflict-affected regions in southern Africa traveled to Dubai refineries, where it was melted and re-stamped. One former Ernst & Young partner who had tracked Dubai's gold trade put it simply: once it's refined, it's practically brand new gold, and evidence of its origins disappears. Now layer that onto sanctions evasion. When the United States and the United Nations moved to cut Iran off from the global financial system, a process that culminated in the 2012 disconnection of Iranian banks from SWIFT, Tehran didn't accept economic isolation. The regime adapted, and Hawala, combined with trade-based money laundering through Dubai, became a primary vehicle for that adaptation. Networks rerouted traded commodities from Europe, Asia, and the United States through Dubai, which made it extraordinarily difficult to determine whether goods were destined for the UAE or headed onward to Iran. In one documented case, 4 Dubai-based front companies, that all registered under generic names that gave nothing away, funneled the equivalent of $800 million in cash to an Iranian exchange through a Hawala-style network. The Reza Zarrab case laid this machinery open. Zarrab, an Iranian-Turkish businessman, built a scheme to launder billions of dollars in Iranian oil revenue through Turkey's state-owned Halkbank, and the mechanism was gold. Turkish gold exports to Iran jumped from $55 million in 2011 to $6.5 billion the following year, and virtually all of that increase came from laundered funds. Over 2 years, Zarrab processed more than $13 billion and personally collected up to $150 million in commissions. When Turkish authorities cracked down, the operation pivoted to falsified food trade. Invoices for wheat shipments that didn't exist, loaded onto ships that couldn't carry the listed tonnage, from origins where the claimed commodities don't grow. One co-conspirator actually had to warn Zarrab that wheat doesn't grow in Dubai. Along a separate corridor, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimated that the Taliban collected roughly $150 million annually in opium-related profits through taxation and cultivation earnings, all transferred through Hawala networks running between Afghanistan, Iran, and Dubai. The same informal channels moving sanctioned government funds also carried narcotics proceeds. The infrastructure doesn't ask its clients what the money is for. The FATF labeled Iran a high-risk jurisdiction with what it called significant strategic deficiencies in countering money laundering and terrorist financing. The United States went further, designating Iran's entire jurisdiction as a primary money laundering concern under Section 311 of the Patriot Act. Congressional testimony has described trade-based value transfer, the practice of over- and under-invoicing goods to shift value across borders, as the new frontier in international money laundering. And at the center of all of it sits Dubai's Hawala infrastructure, a system where legitimate remittances, gold trading, commodity settlement, and sanctions evasion share the same brokers, the same networks, and often the same individual transactions. After September 11, 2001, the international community mounted what was probably the most aggressive campaign in history to bring informal value transfer systems under control. The 9/11 Commission flagged Hawala and similar systems as key channels for terrorist financing. The USA Patriot Act, signed in October 2001, forced all U.S.-based Hawala operators to register with the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, known as FinCEN, as money services businesses, subjecting them to the same record-keeping and reporting rules as banks. Failure to register became a criminal offense. Registration deadline, December 31st, 2001, barely 3.5 months after the attacks. The Financial Action Task Force followed with special recommendations on terrorist financing, and calling on every member country to license or register operators of informal value transfer systems and hold them to the same anti-money laundering standards as formal financial institutions. Enforcement hit hard. Across multiple countries, Hawala networks were shut down, assets frozen, and Hawaladars prosecuted. Al-Barakaat was the highest-profile action, but far from the only one. The results, though, tell a complicated story. Individual cases produced convictions. The Sinaloa cartel Hawala ring was taken apart. Specific brokers went to prison. Cash and narcotics seizures added up. But at the systemic level, the impact on criminal Hawala use has been limited. Multiple academic analyses have reached the same conclusion. These enforcement actions produced little evidence that authorities got substantially closer to identifying and arresting a meaningful number of terrorists or major drug traffickers. The reasons come down to structure, not effort. Hawala operates globally, but regulation works nationally. A network running through India, Canada, the United States, and Mexico falls under 4 legal jurisdictions with 4 regulatory frameworks, and coordinating simultaneous enforcement across all of them demands a level of sustained cooperation that rarely holds. Hawala operators also embed themselves in legitimate businesses. A Hawaladar might run a convenience store, a travel agency, or a phone repair shop, with the money transfer operation as a sideline. And figuring out which shopkeepers are also Hawaladars requires intelligence that's extremely difficult to collect, especially in the tight-knit communities where business happens in languages law enforcement may not speak. And the fundamental economic paradox remains unresolved. You cannot strip away the anonymity, speed, and low cost that attract criminal organizations without simultaneously destroying the features that make the system essential for hundreds of millions of legitimate users. The Al-Barakaat case showed what blunt enforcement looks like in practice: immediate humanitarian consequences, and ultimately, no evidence of the crime that justified the action. Afghanistan, after years of international pressure and military presence, still runs on Hawala. Kabul's money exchange Hawaladars have self-regulated since 1930, now operating under an executive committee with its own enforcement codes, and the academic consensus from researchers at the World Bank and elsewhere converges on a single point: heavy-handed regulation doesn't work, and any reform that excludes Hawaladars from the design process will fail. That challenge is now evolving into something new. Hawala is merging with digital technology. Hawaladars increasingly settle accounts not through cash or gold, but through cryptocurrency, including Bitcoin, Monero, and Tether. The 2024 U.S. National Terrorist Financing Risk Assessment flagged that layering peer-to-peer payment platforms on top of traditional Hawala makes money trails far more complex to follow. In Jammu and Kashmir, our Indian security agencies have identified and frozen over 8,000 bank accounts tied to what they're calling a digital Hawala network, a system where mule accounts receive funds from cybercrime victims, route them through layered transactions, and convert them into cryptocurrency via unverified wallets accessed through VPNs. The pattern is unmistakable: decentralized, trust-based, peer-to-peer value transfer that bypasses central authorities. That's the principle behind Hawala, and it's the exact same principle behind cryptocurrency. Bitcoin didn't invent this model. It digitized something that's been running since the 8th century. The technology changes, the economics don't. So, what does Hawala actually teach us about the economics of organized crime? It shows that criminal financial infrastructure doesn't need to be purpose-built. The most effective systems already exist for legitimate reasons. Drug cartels, terrorist organizations, and sanctioned governments don't create Hawala networks. They exploit ones that serve real economic needs for real communities. And that exploitation works precisely because the system performs exactly as designed: fast, cheap, private, and built on relationships instead of records. Regulation faces a genuine paradox here. The harder you crack down on informal financial networks, the more you risk pushing legitimate users, people who might have operated transparently, further underground. You don't eliminate the system. You make it harder to see. The economics of informal value transfer are rational at every level. Migrant workers save money. Hawaladars earn commissions. Criminal organizations gain access to invisible transfer channels. Sanctioned states maintain economic connections to the outside world. Every participant acts in their own financial self-interest, which is exactly why the system has survived for over a millennium despite every effort to control it. And the digital evolution of finance isn't replacing Hawala's model, it's copying it. Cryptocurrency, peer-to-peer payment apps, decentralized finance, all of these technologies operate on the same principles that Hawaladars have followed since the 8th century. The tools change, the underlying economics stay the same. For over 1,200 years, Hawala has demonstrated something straightforward about money. When people need to move it, they find a way, with or without banks, with or without governments, and with or without the law. The question has never been whether these systems will exist. The question is whether anyone can tell the difference between a construction worker sending $500 to his family and a network moving $500 million for a cartel. So far, the honest answer is not very well. Tomorrow, on the Crime Economics, we covered the 'Ndrangheta, the quiet Calabrian mafia that became the richest criminal organization in Europe by controlling an estimated 60% of the cocaine entering the continent. Subscribe now so you catch it when it drops, and we'll see you tomorrow.